Forget all you know about podcasts. We welcome you to an experience uniquely different. Please join us for our coverage of all entertainment on the fringe of society. The candles are lit, the lights are down low. It is now time to welcome our host as he steps up to the pulpit. The sacrifice has been prepared for the midnight black mass.
Hello, my groovy ghoulies, and ghastly greetings to you all. Welcome to this week's edition of the Midnight Black Mass. It is I, the maniacal minister of the occult, the devil you know, the dragon himself, the Reverend Dan Wilson, here for another edition of the show. Last week, our guest was the incomparable Scott Hudson, the former WCW TNA announcer. He went over a myriad of things in his career, and we had a great long discussion. But guess what? It's not over. He's back for an outstanding part 2, where tonight we're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about the Macho Man Randy Savage. We're going to talk about the total package Lex Luger and his experiences with those men and their reputations versus how they were in real life. He's going to talk about his top 5 announcers of all time and their influences and a whole lot more. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned. Scott Hudson, part 2 is coming up. But before we get to the news, breaking news. Breaking news. This week on the Midnight Black Mass, we have sealed the deal on our guests for the next 4 weeks on the show. So listen up. This is what we've got coming up for you. Next week on the show, the biggest guest we've ever had, and a dear friend of mine. I'm very much looking forward to talking to him. The IWGP World Heavyweight Champion, the phenomenal AJ Styles, will be on the Midnight Black Mass next week. And a week after that, following him, only his opponent, coming up at the end of the month at this huge Ring of Honor card in West Virginia. That's right, former WWE star, used to be known as Evan Bourne, but even before that, and now once again known as Matt Sydal. In 2 weeks will be our guest on the show. And then the preceding 2 weeks after that, we've got one of the hottest up-and-coming tag teams in independent wrestling, traveling all over the country. 2 hard-working kids that I'm really excited to get to talk to. Nick Iggy and Carrie Awful, Team IOU, will be on the program in respective weeks following AJ and Matt Sydal. So huge things coming up for the Midnight Black Mass, and we thank you for joining us here on the Potty Humor Network at youtube.com/pottyhumor, or you're possibly streaming us live on Beyond Ringside, Sundays at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, the Midnight Black Mass at beyondringside.com. So, where can you see me coming up quickly? You can see the Reverend out at Empire Wrestling on September the 20th when they return to the Empire Arena at 22 Austin Avenue. You can check them out online at empirewrestling.net. Huge video on demand library already amassing there. All you have to do is sign up for Empire TV at empirewrestling.net. You simply provide an email address, they send you a password, you log in, you get access to all the content. Just posted today as I record this, the epic 40-plus minute main event from Crazy from the Heat 2014. The Temptation Shawn Tempers, the Empire Heavyweight Champion, takes on his rival of nearly 14 years, the 7-figure deal, Ace Rockwell. Amazing match. You absolutely want to watch the commentary. On the play-by-play is myself. On the color commentary, the Empire Commissioner and matchmaker, Andrew Alexander. Crazy from the Heat 2014 main event. That's right, on empirewrestling.net now. Also follow them on Facebook at facebook.com/Empire Wrestling or on Twitter at EmpirePW. A couple of notes on upcoming Empire events. They'll be back at the Empire Arena on October the 4th and October the 18th. I'll be there both nights. Also, quick note, unfortunately, we have to announce that the Electric Cowboy event on October the 2nd has been canceled. Unfortunately, the franchise actually pulled out of town. There was some interesting news on the local Access News here in town in Chattanooga talking about that. Apparently, there was an issue with underage drinking but the company didn't feel like it was legit. They didn't want to fight the legal battle, so they just pulled their business out of town. So no Electric Cowboy show on October the 2nd, but that is going to be rescheduled with the help of Cat Country 95.3, and there will be an announcement coming up pretty soon on what the date and location of that place is going to be. I'm told it's going to be another well-known Chattanooga establishment, so just stay tuned to the Empire Wrestling Network of Twitter, Facebook, and their website for more info on that. And you can see me there with live Midnight Black Mass talk show segments, as well as doing the play-by-play for all of the video-on-demand content. I'll also be appearing for the AIWF Pro Wrestling Showcase Sunday, October the 26th at 3 p.m. in Red Bank, Tennessee. That's Sunday afternoon, and that is going to be one hell of a lineup. They're really amassing talent from all over the place, all over the country. Talent from double-digit numbers of states. We got people coming from Rudy Boy Gonzalez's camp down in Texas. The Texas Tornadoes will be up there. We've got guys that are real big Georgia standouts like Jeter and like Jacoby Boykins and others coming up. We also got the Strong Style Psycho Tank. Got people from IWA Mid-South coming up. John Wayne Murdoch, a recent star from IWA Mid-South, will be there. Looks like it's really amassing one hell of a lineup, and you definitely want to be there. Check them out at aiwf.net. So, just a brief mention on something we've talked about the last few weeks on the show. We reported, and of course all over the wrestling world has reported, that wrestling legend Jake the Snake Roberts has been hospitalized and had double pneumonia, and it was looking like a really scary scene there for a moment, that possibly more cancer had returned. We're told that he has been released from the hospital and is doing better, so all the best to you, Jake. Glad to hear that you're improving. Very sad news to hear just right before we recorded this, that the former WCW World Tag Team Champion and a guy who was just an impressive specimen and had a hell of a career ahead of him, things just didn't necessarily go the right way. He had some bad luck, but a guy who really had all the potential and tools to be a megastar in professional wrestling, and a guy I got to know personally during the WCW developmental days at NWA Wildside. A man by the name of Sean O'Hare passed away in South Carolina in his home. I just recently found another suicide, so that's very always difficult to hear. I hate to hear that. I saw Trent Van Dries, who's a guy who runs a local message board here in the Mid-South, made the comment that it seems Sean O'Hare was a very good guy with a very dark side, and that I say is pretty accurate. I got to know him okay. He was always just so friendly and professional. He never big-timed anybody, and he was a guy who had very little experience coming out of the power plant there, and immediately with his tag team partner Mark Jindrak got thrust into the limelight. They got a huge push right off the bat, and so if the guys didn't have good heads on their shoulders, then that could have been disastrous for everyone involved. They sent these guys to a small building who on the outside looks like a dilapidated barn. It looks like something that the public would condemn. But on the inside, you open it up, and it's a fairly nice, albeit on a budget, wrestling facility. But so they go here from getting flown all over the country to these big arenas for WCW and appearing in front of these giant crowds to our few hundred people down there in the small gym in Cornelia, Georgia. And never had a bad attitude, was always willing to do whatever we needed, was always really willing to listen and learn and take feedback on his matches. Not all the guys that were down there had that attitude, and a lot of guys that weren't even on TV had that attitude, but Sean O'Hare did not. He was a true professional. We didn't get to spend much time with him outside the shows, but what little I did, he was always very friendly and just cordial and would always remember you and would always chat you up. I really thought that he was onto something with that devil's advocate gimmick that they had him doing in the early 2000s in the WWE. And then they kind of veered off of that to give him a spot as Roddy Piper's protege, which, I mean, who's going to turn that down? But unfortunately, just the bad luck and timing of things that happened there didn't work out for O'Hare, and ultimately he ended up gone from the company. But I don't think that he should be overlooked. I think while his career might have been relatively short, he did accomplish a lot in that short period. And, by all accounts from everyone that knew him, myself included, he was a hell of a guy. So rest in peace, Sean O'Hare. We toll the bell 10 times for you, the proverbial bell. We don't actually have one on hand. Unfortunately, in the wrestling business and life, I said it on Twitter, the mortality rate for every job is 100%. Fortunately, a lot of wrestlers die young. I probably need to install a 10-bell salute sound effect or something to that effect. As sad as it is, that's another former WCW prospect that I worked with who's lost his life there in the development days, and a guy I considered a friend. So that really sucks. If not a friendly acquaintance, if anything else. So, that's a bummer. But on to more positive things. On to life goes on, man. It sucks, and you remember people and you keep them in your heart. But if you don't keep living, then you're not doing them any favors. You're not honoring their memory either. So, looking back on the WWE Network, I've been watching some of the old Monday Nitro episodes, and they've been fantastic. Really, really an awesome period of wrestling. We talked a lot about that with Scott last week, and we'll talk a little bit more about it this week. Loved the unique and odd matches like Rey Mysterio and Bobby Eaton. What? Like, just so random, and you had all of this great talent on the bottom and the top. Me and Scott Hudson will talk about that. One thing that I just saw, just bullshitting with you, the Big Show, the Giant, Paul White, that guy is over 7 foot tall. That guy is at like the 400-pound mark. He has been wrestling on top for 20 years. Can you fucking believe that shit? Like, how is he not crippled? How is he not in a wheelchair? A guy his size, Andre, bless his heart, he had just such a typical time moving around there towards the end of his life. Now, I don't know Show personally. I worked with him a couple times, and he was a cool dude. Really hilarious story about him farting in the go room that I need to tell you one time. If you tweet me at Dragons Rejects and ask me next week to tell the story about the Big Show farting in the gorilla room and Vince McMahon getting mad at it, I will tell you that story. I may have told it in a previous interview with Tank, but if you weren't listening, I'll retell it. So tweet me and let me know. If not, then I'll keep my mouth shut. But the Big Show just he just impresses me, man. Like he does exactly what's required of a guy his size. He's evolved over time. He's adapted. He's managed to stay relevant. And he may not be the guy everybody considers their favorite wrestler or whatever, but my God. And the stuff he was doing when he was so young in those Nitro days, he was so mobile. This guy was good from the time he stepped in the ring, and whatever he's done, and I know he's not comfortable moving around and going to hotel rooms, he said it himself. So to be able to do that for 20 years, to compete at that level, to perform at that level, hats off to that guy, man. Wow, just watching those old Nitros kind of, it's something you kind of always knew in the back of your mind, but you didn't really think about how long he'd been at it, and his body hadn't broke down. He took good care of himself, so incredible, absolutely incredible. Revs rant time, folks. Only thing I got to talk about this week, well, I say the only thing like it's just this brief little topic we're barely going to touch on. So, I may stumble off the intellectual deep end here this week, so bear with me, okay? Hopefully someone can throw me a life preserver if that's the case. But just thinking about things in the wrestling business and life, as I do from time to time, and waxing philosophical with myself. It sounds like a sex act, I know, but it's not. It's brain work. And the brain work brought me to this week for the Revs rant. So, it's kind of more like a stream of consciousness. So, like I say, bear with me. So, you change the world to fit yourself, or can you change yourself to fit the world? Should you? Can you? Which is a more futile effort? Which is more fruitful? It depends on your personal journey, I think. I think that philosophy is highly relevant to professional wrestling. There's plenty of ailments within wrestling in the modern world. It's been a long-standing tradition for the boys to quote-unquote book the territory, as Steve Austin likes to say on his podcast. While they're on long car rides or out having a beer or hanging out together. They like to espouse the problems in the business and how they can fix them, and how they've got all the answers. And certainly nothing wrong with that. Actually, it's just the guys bullshitting. They're hanging out. They're bouncing ideas off of each other. Few of those ideas are ever going to see the outside of the car. Even fewer are ever going to be put into practice. So only those that have that mentality of are they going to be able to change the world to fit their liking and succeed at that will follow these ideas through. Is it possible to change the world to suit you? Well, I'd say the reward is the greatest in that scenario, but also is the risk. It might be a noble cause, but if you spend your entire career or your life trying to change the world and you fail, then you've wasted a whole lot of time. I think maybe from my perspective, you may see greater success as somebody who is flexible enough to learn how to deal with things they can't change, impose their will where prudent, but also learn how to adapt to the existing climate and find a way to make it work for you. Now, trust me, I'm speaking from experience here. So, if you take the philosophy of taking the world as it is and trying to make it work for you, then, well, maybe then you're onto something. So, trust me, like I say, I'm preaching from experience. I wasted a lot of times making moves that should have benefited me. Instead, I was trying to change the world or bring back old school or whatever I was going to do, right? So, essentially, I'll take you back. I'll tell you a little story about why this is all relevant to me. Back in the Anarchy days, when we first started the Devil's Rejects and we were running so white hot, the territory was exploding. I'd never seen anything like that business-wise in my career. And the indies, it's hard to see something like that because you get shows that do good for a short period. And ultimately, that's what ended up happening. But Anarchy has proven the others that they outlast them because they have the longevity. But for right now, why this is relevant is we were so white hot and we had that old school heat so early in the Rejects run. I was convinced, I was sold that we could lead this to a renaissance industry-wide of bringing back all of the old school tenets, and this old Southern territorial wrestling like Memphis and Georgia could come back and it could take a regional stronghold. And maybe it could have. We'll never know, I don't think. My goal, and I had no stake in it other than just being an advisor and a participant as a performer, but I wanted to make Anarchy a major player in wrestling. I thought that we really had the tools to do that. And unfortunately, the window came and went. There was some complacency that set in with the ownership, Jerry Palmer, etc. And unforeseen circumstances, personal things that happened that they couldn't have controlled, and I'm not blaming anybody for it. It's just looking at it in hindsight. Bill Barron's eventually stepped in and got the new owner on board, and Franklin Dove came in, and now they've re-identified themselves and rebranded themselves yet again. So trust me, they're doing fine. This is not anything about them, but it's just about me possibly overreaching with my expectations. I don't regret any of the time I spent there helping the guys, getting the book or performing in the great stuff that we did, or having the epic battles that we did. They're just amazingly memorable stuff. Hell, the 2006 War Games was, as of this date, still the most memorable thing I've ever done, and that's in a myriad of a lot of fun stuff. So, I don't regret any of that, but I do regret maybe trying to be so obsessive and trying to change the world instead of working on my craft as a performer. While I was doing that, I could have been doing it more instead of focusing my energy on this other stuff. So, I should have been trying to expand the performer side of me instead of maybe trying to think that we had this legit shot at becoming a territory where we were all going to make a living. So, instead, over recent years, I've tried to make the existing system work for me instead of pretending that it's something it's not. So to those whose success comes solely on your terms, more power to you. If that works for you and you can change the world, hell yeah, man, go for it. But for me, Like, you see, the allegories of black and white are still the most effective way to tell a story, but real life isn't the same. So for me, you have to learn to make intelligent compromise to navigate this realm to your benefit. That's all. What I'm saying is, you can still impose your will when necessary and when prudent, but I found as I grow older, the more flexible you are to accepting things as they are, the more success you're going to have. That's all for this week's edition of the Revs Rant. We're going to have a word from our sponsors right quick, and we'll be right back with our guest of the week. Mr. Scott Hudson will be joining us for part 2 of this amazing interview. Don't go anywhere.
Whether you're having an autograph session, personal appearance, or live event, we got just the person you need to contact for all of those needs. SBI Bookings is home of some of the best stars in the wrestling industry today. They provide you with the best talent this business has to offer, from Kevin Nash, Larry Zbyszko, Scott Steiner, and many, many more. So who will you contact next time you're planning an event? The men of SBI Bookings. Check them out at sbibookings.com.
The Midnight Black Mass is pleased to announce we have become an affiliate of the World Wrestling Network at wwnlive.com, the home of the finest iPay-per-view and video on demand in all of professional wrestling, featuring promotions like Dragon Gate USA, Evolve, Combat Zone Wrestling, OVW, Shimmer, Shine, $5 Wrestling, and the vaunted Kayfabe commentaries with their U-Shoot, their guest booker, and their timeline series. You have to check it out. Of course, you can always go to their main page at wwnlive.com, but if you will, do us a solid, go to facebook.com/pottyhumor or follow me on Twitter at Dragons Rejects. We'll be posting our own unique links to these events as affiliates. If you go through our link, they give us a little kickback, and we greatly appreciate it. It'll help the Midnight Black Mass and the Potty Humor Network. Big event coming up for WWN Live, Evolve 34, coming up on Saturday, September the 13th in Elmhurst, New York. Evolve heavyweight title in the main event. Drew Galloway, the former Drew McIntyre, will defend the championship against Rich Swann. That's Saturday, September 13th, 8 p.m., Elmhurst, New York. But you can watch it live on WWNlive.com or click the link, baby, Facebook.com/pottyhumor.
Wrestling fans, Anarchy Wrestling television tapings are the second and fourth Saturdays of every month at 4236 Level Grove Road in Cornelia, Georgia. For more information on Anarchy Wrestling and on the shows, to watch the television product, and a whole lot more, go to anarchy-wrestling.net. That's Anarchy Wrestling, the second and fourth Saturdays of every month in Cornelia, Georgia.
Get your exclusive Midnight Black Mass merchandise at midnightblackmass.spreadshirt.com. We have Rejects t-shirts, we have Midnight Black Mass t-shirts, we have Get Your Pulse coffee mugs, Potty Humor t-shirts, and more. If you want to have all of the coolest swag, go to midnightblackmass.spreadshirt.com.
And we're back on the Midnight Black Mass, and our guest returning this week for part 2 of this exclusive interview. Former WCW announcer. We talked about his career at length last week and the variety of promotions getting to World Championship Wrestling. And we're going to talk about a whole lot more right now. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Hudson on the line.
Once again, this is Disco Inferno. I must have dialed the wrong number.
You slid in again, Glenn. Damn it.
I swear to God, I keep getting Disco's text messages. I don't know what's going on with that. Reverend, what's going on?
Oh, man, just having a good day. Just enjoyed a day out on the lake with the family. Now sitting down for a little Midnight Black Mass business. So it's all good, man. How about yourself?
Oh, about the same. No Black Mass, but I've been doing the dishes, the laundry, and the trash, and just put a peach cobbler in the oven for my darling, beautiful wife, and getting everything set up for another week at work.
Right on, man. Well, you lived through the 60s and 70s, so I'm sure you participated in a black mass at some point, but we won't talk about that now.
Very nice. Thank you.
But, so, last week on the show, we were wrapping up at light speed your WCW career, and we talked about the beginning and the end, and there's a lot more I want to talk about. But just as far as we didn't really talk much about the middle because the time was running out. You talked about some of the things, that some of the difficulties you had and some of the highlights, and how you were glad that it was over, that it was a stressful situation, but it was awesome. But in the ring, match-wise, as a fan, I know you're a fan and I'm a fan.
Yeah.
What was some of your favorite stuff to call, like as far as talent-wise? Who did you enjoy being able to paint that picture for?
Well, honestly, I was lucky enough that when I had the run in WCW, I was there at the same time that men like, the Revolution, like Eddie Guerrero and God rest his soul, and Dean Malenko and Perry Saturn, and for better or for worse, Chris Benoit, and then the luchadors like Ray Jr. and Juventud and Psychosis and La Parca. Those guys were all coming up underneath in WCW. I was there at the beginning of that, and to watch that evolve and just become such a huge part of our programming. You name it. Mix those guys up. Throw Eddie and Chris and Dean and Perry with any luchador and just, put them in like one of those things that tumble around the lottery numbers and pull out two. Those are the highlights for me.
Right. I'm just watching some of those old nitros they've got up on the network and kind of going back through that and reliving it from the beginning all the way through. And, God, those guys were so good, all of the aforementioned people.
And the thing is, Reverend, that people and I certainly don't want to disparage anyone, but it's easy to forget how good that was because we've gotten so far away from that now with the Attitude Era, and then who even as WCW, as we had on top of it, we were pushing to the moon. People just forget how good those guys were. That you would watch a show and you would watch, Hogan and Piper and Flair and Savage, who were, God love them, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years past their prime, working on top, and underneath you had the greatest wrestlers in the business, filling out the entirety of the underneath, and you put people in there like Page and Goldberg and Sting and guys who were in the semi-mains and eventually elevated to the mains. Those were some incredible shows.
It's a really unique roster. It was really an awesome, the proverbial three-ring circus. As most old-time wrestling promoters always use that analogy that you have to give them the three-ring circus, so that if they don't like
That's
the
right.
acrobats, maybe they like the bearded lady, etc. WCW had all of it with the cruiserweights and then the old-time top stars with the star power, and some of them were past their prime, like Savage, until he really got so hurt that he couldn't fly around anymore. I still remember him being able to go pretty good. But Hogan was really beat up by that point still, but you still had all of that star power on top.
Let me tell you a quick story, Reverend, and this goes back to before either of their runs in WCW, but at WrestleMania 3, at what is legendarily referred to as the 92,000 people at 71,000 people, but that, when people worry about is wrestling a work, yeah, it is, but it's way more than those punches really aren't connecting. It's numbers, it's everything. There was nowhere close to 92,000 people in the Silverdome that night, but regardless, at that show, I've heard both Savage and Steamboat tell me, and this is not to disparage either man, it was how they both operated, that when they were given that match, when at the time it was Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson booking the WWF, they gave them the match and told them to finish, and that was basically it. This was 1987, and they laid out the match together. What was going to end up becoming, for my money, probably the third best match of the entirety of the 1980s. And what would happen was Steamboat was ready to call it in the ring. You know, we've got a bell and a bell. Let's call it in the ring. Savage was so meticulous that he would lay out every move of every match, no matter how long it was going or who his opponent was. Well, he's in there against Ricky Steamboat, who's one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all time. So what would happen is they were building up to the match. They would work house shows and TVs together. Either Savage or Steamboat would come up to each other and give a number, 125. I mean, pull it out of thin air. And that was a move set in the match. There were that many. And, you know, if Savage came up to Steamboat backstage at a TV 3 weeks before Mania 3 and say 125, Steamboat would say arm drag into an arm bar into a leg scissors. And then Savage would know the next move. That's exactly how they laid that match out. And where Steamboat really wasn't used to working that way, that was exactly how Savage wanted to do it. So what you had was Savage, the ultimate technician, the ultimate details guy, against Steamboat, who's the ultimate call-it-in-the-ring guy. They laid it out. Savage laid it out. Steamboat was completely on board with it. And you go back and watch that match now, and it still is breathtaking in its intricacies and how it tells the story and how it gets the storyline over and moves everything forward. And it was laid out by Randy Savage himself.
That's amazing. It'll always be considered one of the greatest matches of all time. It's still stood the test of time since 1987, and I don't doubt it will stand it for eternity. Savage, now, there's a unique character in wrestling, in my opinion, one of the all-time greatest wild men, as far as you just never knew. And everybody said that was legit, that, you know, that was Randy. Did you have any sort of relationship with him working there at the time?
Well,
there you are. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but you dropped off. Right as I begin to the end of the question is when it died. So you just want to pick right back up with that answer.
That was absolutely one of the greatest soliloquies and eulogies for Randy Savage I've ever heard. But I'll do the best I can to repeat it, Reverend. He was a perfectionist in every way that he operated, from bell to bell, backstage, getting to the building, coming home from the building. Randy was a perfectionist. He wanted nothing more than to entertain the people and to make the promoters happy and to earn the money that he was given at the end of the night. And even though I think with his dad, he tried to promote here and there, and I don't know if that ever panned out, but he never really, in my opinion, aspired to be that. He wanted to be a wrestler. He was an athlete. He was a baseball player in the minor leagues of Major League Baseball, and then he, worked his way up through the ICW in Kentucky, and then into the, for a cup of coffee there in the Mid-South in Memphis, and then to the WWE, WWF, rather, back then, and he was the consummate professional. I have nothing but the highest respect for Randy Savage as a person, and especially as a worker. He was tremendous. He was fun to watch and never a disappointment.
Yeah, doing this 15 years, I've been fortunate to meet most of my heroes that I grew up watching. I never got to meet Randy Savage, and that I always regret that because he was one of my absolute favorites. And it's great to hear that, despite some of the wild stories, those that really knew him knew that he was a fantastic human being.
He was a great guy. Now, he was intense as hell. The promos, and I'm not about to begin to do a Randy Savage impersonation, but those promos that he would do legendarily with Gene Okerlund back in WWF and in WCW, that was him. He wasn't screwing around. He wasn't like when the red light was on, he was intense and he was hyper-focused, and then when the red light goes off, he's farting around and playing cards and, drinking and carrying on. He was a perfectionist. He was a workaholic, but not a jerk at all. He was a great guy, and of all the guys that I had the pleasure of working with over the years that never had a chance to book, I would put Randy and Scott Levy, as the two guys I really, really wish could have gotten the book in their hand with the pencil to book a promotion going forward. Scotty's still alive. I mean, Scott's not dead. He's terrific. He lives not too far from here, but I think he's pretty much out of the business, and for whatever reason won't get that opportunity. But Savage, unfortunately, has passed away, and I would really like to have seen what someone with his focus and his intelligence could have done running the creative end of a company.
That's a very interesting proposition. You never really think of who could have been a great booker, because there's plenty out there, or there, at least historically there were. There's not so many anymore. There's still a few, but moving on into WCW stuff, just while we're talking about the misunderstood WCW folks, there's a guy that headlined WCW that I always thought kind of got a bum rap with wrestling fans. People love to take giant piles of shit on Lex Luger, and I don't really understand it. I mean, I know towards the end of his career, like a lot of those guys, he got less mobile in the ring. But, I mean, and granted, okay, he was always in the ring with guys like Flair to make him look great, but he always held up his end of the deal, and he drew money for WCW. He was a legitimate star for them. Why do you think it is that Lex doesn't get that kind of credit?
Well, Reverend, I'll tell you this. You and I are separated by, probably around 7 or 8 years in age. And I grew up in the 70s and into the 80s. And I remember being around 20 years old in 1985 when Lex and Ed the Bull Gantner were brought into Florida Championship Wrestling. I grew up in deep South Georgia. And that's a hell of a place to grow up. But as a wrestling fan, it was perfect because I had Florida Championship, I had Gulf Coast out of Alabama, I had Georgia Championship that I could watch. The WWE came in on WWOR out of Secaucus, New Jersey. So I got every territory on television every week. And I watched Luger and Ed the Bull Gantner break in. I remember that 1 week with Gordon Soley and probably Coach John Heath on the Florida show, where they brought them in as literally this is their first weekend, and he wasn't called Lex Luger, he was called The Luger, which I've never to this day understood, but he was The Luger. And he was paired up with Sir Oliver Humperdinck, God rest his soul, one of the greatest of all time. And you look at the guy, and even then when he's wearing like a wife beater and black tights, you're like, my God, this guy is just an insane physical specimen. How can he fail? And then the bell rings, and you're like, oh, God, he really has no clue what's going on in there. And then the next week, they put him and Ed the Bull Gantner and Dewey Forte, who was a college football star that never amounted to anything in wrestling, with Hiro Matsuda and trained them. And I watched Luger literally progress week to week to week on that television program, and they eventually paired him up with Barry Windham, who is one of the all-time greats, period. And it was that pairing that helped him. And when he eventually decided to leave Florida and come to Jim Crockett Promotions, God almighty, go back to YouTube and do a Google search for Lex Luger versus Bruiser Brody in Lakeland, Florida, with Bill Alfonso as the referee, when the Florida promotion really was pissed at Luger and pretty much told Brody to go in there and make it a real fight, and Luger wasn't a real fighter by any stretch. Great athlete, not a fighter, and pretty much just ran out of the building against Brody that night in Lakeland because that was his last night in before he headed to Crockett. And then when he went to Crockett protected him. Dusty Rhodes, one of the greatest of all time, protected him and knew how to build him instead of being a real jerk to him like the crowd down in Florida was being. And he worked his way up, but to his everlasting credit, he was about 2 steps behind where his body should have led him. With that body, he should have been the Hogan, the Hulk Hogan of the 1990s. There's just no question. When Vince saw him, he built the entirety of the World Bodybuilding Federation, the WBF. Well, you remember that back in the early 90s. And then when that just completely wet the bed, he brought him in to be the All-American Lex Luger and had him slam Yokozuna on the Intrepid, and then with the Lex Express, with the bus, with the red, white, and blue. Vince tried everything to get this guy over as the next Hulk Hogan, and it just did not work. And that's not a knock on Lex so much as it's praising Hogan. No one could ever be that again. Hogan had raised the bar so high that even Lex, with all of that push and all of the ability that he had in the ring, which of course was limited, no way was he going to get there. And I think that's what hurt Lex, is that when he was in WCW, when he was in Florida, he came up to a level. He came to Crockett. He came up several levels higher. He goes to the WWE and he debuts as Narcissus or whatever that BS was with Heenan they did. That was terrible. And then they make him into the All-American Lex Luger. That should have put him over the top. But he was having to follow Hogan. That was never going to work with Luger. He was always going to be 2 or 3 steps lower than Hogan. And that's why Lex got the heat that he got, because he achieved as high as his ability would take him. Unfortunately, that wasn't as high as his elevated him, and that's not his fault. He did a good job. He did what he was asked to do. He just didn't have the charisma or the ability on the mic or in the ring as Hogan did. He was an upper mid-card guy who got pushed to the top of the biggest company in the world and got exposed.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I think, and I don't think that slights Luger, as you said. Interesting about that physique, it was magnificent, and it was in a day when everybody didn't have a six-pack. You look at Raw now, sure, everybody's ripped to shreds, but in those days, that was not the case, and that literally was his gimmick. That was that he was the ripped guy.
That's right. Back then you had, the Roadies and Billy Jack Haynes and Luger and, Superstar Graham, maybe, who was, pushing the end of his career. And as far as guys that were pushed to the top and had any kind of ability, that was about it. Now, you've got like Zack Ryder and Matt Morgan, who are ripped to shreds, who can't even get booked. But this was, 30 years ago. Yeah, he was one of the very few.
Excellent. Well, we talked about a lot of WCW. You gave all your final thoughts, so I don't think there's really any reflection to go back on other than it was just always a pleasure. I enjoyed listening to you always. I thought as an announcer, you carried the torch of the classic wrestling announcer. And speaking of that, let's talk about announcers. Influences on you, like where would you rank, I'd say top 5 announcers, because I'm always interested in that opinion from other guys who do that job. And who were your biggest influences out of that crew?
Well, the first, bar none, number 1 and number 2 is far down the list, is Lance Russell from Memphis.
Hell yeah.
I watched Lance from an early age. I was lucky enough to be able to get the syndicated Memphis, the Mid-Southern promotion from the early 80s. And if you go back and watch, and you can do this on YouTube now, thank God for 2014, you can do all of it. You go back and watch Lance, and he wasn't really calling a wrestling show. He was announcing a television show, and that's the difference. There's a fine line between announcing a wrestling show, which is what the guys like Ron Trongard and Ed Capral and Jim Carlisle and those guys back in the early 70s were doing, and what Lance did. Lance was selling a television product instead of selling a wrestling product, and he understood that it was a transitional period. that he wasn't trying to lure in the wrestling fans. He was trying to lure in the viewers. People that were going to watch that show as wrestling fans were going to watch it if me or you or Bill Behrens or Ice Train or anybody else was announcing. They were going to watch. It was the guys that made the flipping pass. They had to, you had 2 seconds to grab it. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this word on your show, Reverend, but it's what Jim Cornette referred to as the bullshit factor. Jim Cornette told me one time, he said, when you're an announcer, and this is great advice from Cornette and Tony Schiavone and all these other guys that I grew up learning from, he said, if somebody flips to your show, you've got about 3 seconds, literally 3 seconds, that what they hear, not what they see, but what they hear will make the viewer go, oh, that's bullshit, click, and they'll go to the next channel. And that's what Cornette taught me. And Lance Russell didn't learn anything from Jim Cornette. It was actually vice versa, as Cornette will tell you. But that's what Cornette taught me, and that's what he learned from Lance. When you watch Lance Russell call those Memphis shows, 3 seconds, you're hooked. You'd flip on one of those shows, and Lance can just be saying something like, oh, and again, and you're hooked. You can't turn away. And you watch somebody like Michael Cole, whom I really do not like at all. You flip over to WWE Raw, you're going to hear him say something about a diva. You're going to hear King say something about her boobs. You're going to hear Layfield make some crack about Terry Funk. That's bullshit. Click. They're going to turn away, and they're turning away in droves. But what you want to do is be able to grab that click, click, click viewer, and Lance was the best at that. So he is easily my number one. My number two is, again, without question, Jim Ross. And Jim Ross, before he went to the WWE, Jim Ross in the WWE is still number two. But Jim Ross in Mid-South with Bill Watts, and even with WCW in the NWA days in that transition, you could not turn away. When you turned on to that television show, you could not click away when you heard Jim Ross. You go back, and I encourage all of your listeners on your podcast to go YouTube UWF, or maybe it's Mid-South, Eddie Gilbert, Bill Watts, and the Russians. And you listen to Eddie Gilbert and Bill Watts and Jim Ross tell that story, and it's like 4 minutes, and at the beginning of it, you will be like, oh, this is another wrestling angle, and at the end, you will be red-faced, jumping up and down, pounding the floor, ready to pay your $8 to go see the next show at whatever building they're working. That's how good Jim Ross was. So Lance Russell, Jim Ross, and underneath him there is a huge drop-off. But the third person on my list would be Tony Schiavone. And Tony Schiavone had the great misfortune of having to call some of the stupidest booking of all time, and on top of that, having people in your ear telling you to say some of the stupidest stuff of all time, yet he never lost his credibility. When people talk about Tony, for whom I have the most respect, when people talk about Tony, they go on and on and on about the night Cactus won the WWF World Championship, and the line was fed to him, well, that'll put butts in seats. And that's a stupid line, and Tony will tell you that. But you know what people remember? Tony saying that. It's because they remember him, and they were listening to him when he said it. So Lance Russell, Jim Ross, Tony Schiavone, and then the drop-off is precipitous down to number 4. And at number 4, I would put Gordon Soley, only because I remember him from my childhood, from Georgia Championship in the early 70s, Florida Championship in the early 70s, and Gulf Coast in the late 70s and early 80s. And he's just the voice of my childhood, and I remember him and respect him immensely. And number 5 is a man that this business misses and needs, and this is 2014, and it is not too late, and he needs to be back in the mainstream and at the top of this business, and that's Joey Styles. I've called so many shows by myself, and I can tell you, calling it by yourself is, hell, you've done it, Reverend. You know what
I'm
that's
doing
like.
It now
It's
Empire,
harder than all hell to do when you don't have somebody even just to take a break and take a drink of water, much less feed off of and get feedback from. But Joey Styles calling ECW is perfection as a solo announcer, and it's pretty close to perfection as an announcer in general. So if you're asking my top 5, and that was your question about an hour and a half ago, I would say Lance Russell, Jim Ross, Tony Schiavone, Gordon Soley, and Joey Styles in that order.
Interesting. I mean, I don't disagree with any of those picks. I agree with your sentiments on all of them. I think Jim Ross in the Mid-South, all the way up to WCW, was the most credible wrestling announcer of all time. He made it feel more like a legitimate sport than any other wrestling announcer, and I think that was a lot to do with his football background and other things. But
and that's the thing. A good wrestling announcer has done other sports. I did football and basketball and baseball before I ever did wrestling. I did that for 8 years before I did wrestling. And when you do legitimate, unscripted sports and you don't know what's coming next, there's no better training ground. As I get people coming up and asking me, what can I do to be a good announcer? And the first thing I tell them, and I'll tell you the same thing, is first, go get an education, because announcing anything never lasts. Secondly, as an announcer, don't ever know what's going to happen before it happens. That raw passion is way better than whatever scripted bullshit line Vince McMahon or Kevin Dunn or any of these other people who were stuck in 1988 could feed you through an IFB. Raw passion will get over a lot faster than a scripted reaction to what's happening in the ring.
Outstanding. And I love the thoughts on Tony Schiavone. There's another guy I thought that just always got unfairly crapped on by the smart mark wrestling community, or whatever you want to call him. I think he's starting to get more respect now, finally, that people can go back and really see what a talented guy he was. And I contend even through the worst periods of WCW, he was a total pro. Yeah, a lot of times he was saying dumb shit because that's what they were telling him to say. But, some of the garbage that they were trying to sell in the ring during, like, the year 2000, and he's in there trying to sell it like it's important and like it means something, and you got to respect that, and there's a huge influence on me.
And I'm sitting there looking at him, shoulder to shoulder, sitting at the announce table with 20,000 people in the building, relying on him like, what are we supposed to be putting over here? My God, Sting just got thrown off of a 75-foot scaffold by Vampiro on fire, but yet Sting's going to main event the pay-per-view in 7 days? How do we put that over? And, that Tony was great with that. And Tony Schiavone gave me one of the greatest pieces of advice I ever heard as an announcer. And from Joe Pedicino back in the late 80s and early 90s all the way up until the end with Mike Tenay, who I would actually put number 6 on my list, Tony told me this. He said, a good announcer will never draw one additional viewer to a television program, but a bad one will chase away thousands. And every time I walk down that aisle and walk down to the announce table, I remember that. I actually said that to myself every Monday night as we were doing Nitro. I don't know if he knew how important that was to me. And I've told him 100 times since. I told him, God, as recently as, a month ago. I still talk to him. But that meant everything to me. A good announcer won't bring one more viewer, but a bad one will chase away thousands. You can't ever forget that. And Michael Cole, God damn it, if you by chance you're listening to this, write that down have it tattooed on your ass, on the inside of your eyelids, because you are causing problems up there, brother, and that's part of it.
Some straight shooting there from Scott Hudson. Pulling no punches. That's the way we like it here on the Midnight Black Mass. Looking like we've got about 6 minutes left in the recording time. One thing I didn't really address in the last interview was that you did a little bit of work for TNA Wrestling, and I saw you actually had a trading card that was released with the TNA set, and I wasn't even really aware that you did that much with them. It shows you how closely I'm paying attention to things. Jeez.
Well, I'll tell you the truth, Dan. When I was in Georgia All-Star and in North Georgia and Global and WCW, that 11, 12-year run, I was learning. I was learning about the business. I mean, it's one thing to read the sheets, and that's what I did with Dave Meltzer and Wade Keller and Ron Lemieux from 1984 forward. I learned the business from reading the sheets, and then I got in the business and learned it, organically by being immersed in it. But when WCW went under in 2001, I worked for USA Championship Wrestling in Nashville with Burt Prentice, who I also just think the world of. I actually got to work with Jim Cornette there.
That's right, you were color, and I was the ring announcer on those shows.
That's correct. And then when I got to TNA in 2002, that's when I was completely comfortable with television, with the business, with everything. Up from 1990 until 2002, it was like going to graduate school in television and professional wrestling. It was like getting 2 master's degrees. And then when I got there, I had graduated. I got my degree. I, put on my cap and gown and walked across the stage, got my diploma. And then when I got to TNA, I didn't have to worry. Was I going to forget an angle? Was I going to forget a storyline? Was I going to forget my words? And TNA gave me so much, wide open space, especially working with people like Bob Ryder and Mike Tenay and Jeff Jarrett and Dutch Mantel and, oh my God, Bill Banks and Vince Russo. They said, they knew. They trusted me, and that trust is worth millions of dollars, actually. When they say, Scott, you're going to interview the Free Live crew, you've got, 2.5 minutes. When you finish, throw it back to the ring. You ready? Yes, sir. And then, in 30 seconds, I'm ready to go. And when I got to that point, as you know, Reverend, when you get to that point, when they can give you that kind of cue and that kind of info, and the red light goes on, and you nail it, and you don't stumble over your words, and you hit the mark, and you hit the time, that's as good as any orgasm you'll ever have in your life. And that's what I had at TNA. Every week was just awesome. And that's still my home. I hope they make it. I hope they, tie a knot in the rope and hang on, and I'm there whenever they want me back. I miss those guys. I miss that promotion. I miss everything about it. I hope they can hang on, but I love TNA, especially since they've gotten rid of, the older guys, as it were, and the last 6 months of TNA has been some of the best television product in wrestling in a long, long time.
Yeah, I still got a lot of friends up there myself, and I'm rooting for them as well. I think the wrestling business needs that extra promotion. It's an extra place with jobs, regardless of what you feel about what they've done, and they have made a nice turnaround. And I just, like you say, I hope they stick around.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
But so we're looking at got about 3 minutes left. So I want to thank you for coming on the show again. And wow, it went by so fast again. It's like talking to you. It's just time goes by so quickly.
Well, thanks. I think.
No, that is a compliment. We've got such a great wrestling history lesson.
I'll tell you this, Dan. You and I both had the great pleasure of working with Bill Behrens and with Stephen Prazak. You know as well as I do that Steve's my best friend in the whole world, second to my wife, Casey. And Steve and I have been best friends for pushing 30 years. And Bill and I have been friends for almost that long. And in this business, as we sit here in 2014, as we approach fall of 2014, being able to, just call each other and talk and bullshit and carry on and talk about the business. And I do that with Steve constantly, and Bill constantly, and Pedicino and Bonnie and John Horton that I worked with in Global. That is so much more than money in your bank account. We all have real jobs. We all have careers that we've developed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But being able to have that kind of friendship and that kind of long-term stuff that organically grew out of a crazy business like professional wrestling is worth all of the money in the world. And I wouldn't take anything for the people like you and Steve and Joe and Bill and Bonnie and John and the people that I've gotten to know in this business over the last, Louise, 25, 27 years. It's worth all of the money that I didn't make in this business.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate you considering me as part of that elite group of individuals, and it's been a pleasure to know you over the years, and thank you for joining us on the show. Folks, we are out of time, but next week on the show, the hottest free agent in all of professional wrestling, the phenomenal one himself, the IWGP World Heavyweight Champion, the one and only AJ Styles, will be here. Join us next week on the Midnight Black Mass. Keep one foot in the gutter and one fist in the gold. This is the Reverend, and I'm out.
Thank you.